Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk on the benefits and costs and trade-offs of helping cost-burdened middle-income renters. Before we start, just want to highlight that we're in the midst of a really exciting and busy season of events this fall. These include, in the next month or so, hybrid or online events on a variety of topics, including using housing policies to foster connections in diverse communities, rethinking our narratives about people who are experiencing homelessness, assessing the benefits of legalizing mid-rise, single-stair, multifamily housing developments, creating effective, comprehensive, and accessible programs that help low-income homeowners make needed repairs, and at the end of next month, a half-day event on fostering innovative approaches to creating more affordable housing. You can find more information about all of these events on our website. Also want to highlight that next Friday, we will again be co-sponsoring Hack-A-House, a 24-hour virtual competition that gives students from around the country the opportunity to develop and pitch innovative ideas to make housing more affordable. 3 winning proposals will share a total of $12,000 in prize money. Again, information about Hack-A-House and everything else is on our website. Now on to today's speaker. Alex Herman is a senior researcher here at the center whose work generally focuses on housing markets, demographics, and housing policy. Alex will be discussing key findings from a new working paper that he co-authored with our colleagues Whitney Ergood-Obricki and Peyton Whitney, as well as Nora Cahill, a Joint Center student research assistant. They examined the benefits, costs, and trade-offs associated with the growing number of state and local programs that assist the many cost-burdened middle-income renters. Alex will take about 40 to 45 minutes to review the paper's key findings and to highlight some of the policy trade-offs that are associated with these programs. I'll then moderate a Q&A, drawing in large measure from the questions that you can submit via Zoom's Q&A feature. Peyton will also be monitoring those questions and, where possible, answering them online. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. We'll end as close to 1:15 p.m. as possible. Video and slides from this event will be posted early next week. Alex, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I am going to share my screen here, and I'll trust you'll let me know if there are any issues doing that. As David mentioned, I'm Alex Herman. I'm a researcher here at the Joint Center. It's great to be back. I'm excited today to present a paper near and dear to my heart that I wrote along with 3 of my colleagues who Dave mentioned. That paper is subsidizing the middle, policies, trade-offs, and costs of addressing middle-income affordability challenges. I'm going to start with a summary by way of introducing the topic, if I can get there. There we go. And it's to say that affordability challenges have grown to record levels across the U.S. and especially for middle-income renters. These burdens vary significantly across the country depending on market conditions. In response to that growing affordability challenges for middle-income households, a growing number of state and local governments have created policies and programs to address those challenges. But affordability challenges remain greatest and most pervasive for lower-income households. As a result, and the purpose of this paper, the purpose of this presentation, is to consider the trade-offs, consider the benefits that are entailed with this growing emphasis on middle-income housing needs. In short, what happens when you prioritize middle-income housing needs? Who are you more likely to serve? Where do they live? Who are they? Et cetera. I think 2 things motivate this research primarily. One is something that my colleague Dan McHugh presented last week at this seminar when presenting the State of the Nation's housing. And it's the growing affordability challenges that renter households face. Renters have experienced record level affordability challenges in 2022. Fully 22.4 million renter households were cost burdened that year, meaning they spent more than 30% of their income on housing. But much of this growth, and this is a slide that comes from our State of the Nation's housing project that Dan presented, was driven by middle income renter households. So 41% of renters earning $45,000 to $75,000 had cost burdens, and that's up 5.5 percentage points since before the pandemic in 2019, and more than double the rate from 2 decades ago in 2001. So the second kind of underlying motivation for this research is a growing interest in middle-income housing programs at the same time in response to this increased affordability challenges, especially up the income scale. And at the federal level, you've seen the reintroduction of a national initiative to address these challenges in the form of the Workforce Housing Tax Credit Act, which is essentially the low-income housing tax credit program, but for a more middle-income tax bracket, also known as the middle-income housing tax credit in previous iterations. At the same time, you've seen a growing number of state and local efforts. I won't summarize those now because we'll spend most of the time talking about it today, or those programs and efforts today. These programs are often pitched as workforce housing programs. And there's a common goal among these, and it's the idea that people who work in a community should be able to afford to live in that community. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the idea of workforce housing, and especially how it gets operationalized and used in these programs, can be a little bit problematic, and why, in particular, I'll be using the term middle income housing. And when I use workforce housing, it's usually with scare quotes like you see there. It's also worth recognizing, we'll discuss more about what makes these programs in some ways very controversial. There is a significant concern, especially among housing advocates, that these programs could potentially detract from the much greater housing needs of low-income renters, and even potentially stigmatize affordable housing recipients themselves. So that is a little bit of the introduction and what motivates this project. To give you a sense of where we're going to go here, I'll next talk about the actual middle income housing policies and programs that we studied. Then we'll take a look using a common definition used in those programs to assess middle income renter affordability challenges and consider who these households are and who would be served by such programs. Then we'll talk more about kind of the problematic nature of the concept of workforce housing, especially how it's used. We'll consider the trade-offs and potential benefits of these programs, and then I'll end with some policy implications and another little bit of summary. But first, to talk about the state and local middle-income housing programs, as promised. We began our research with a scan of middle-income housing programs across the U.S. So we pulled these policies and programs from a number of sources, particularly news sites, from state and local government websites and databases, as well as the NLIHCs, the National Low Income Housing Coalitions, their rental housing programs database. And that revealed no less than about 40 potential programs to possibly be included in our study. Ultimately, to kind of narrow it down and give us a manageable subset, we created kind of separate criteria for inclusion for analysis in our work. And there's 3 things in particular. 1, the program needed to be explicitly motivated by middle income or workforce housing challenges. And that needed to be true in the title of the program, the name of the program, or in the rationale given for the program. The program also must include or involve direct or indirect public subsidies, and these took the form of grants, loans, in-kind donations of land, but also property tax exemptions and construction loan guarantees. And a third criteria for inclusion was that these programs need to be focused on rental housing. And we decided to look at rental housing in particular, given the much greater affordability challenges that renter households face and the growing challenges they face across the US. So this meant excluding some programs. So those exclusively focused on for sale housing. We look at programs that have a for sale component, but also look at rental housing. And there's a number of those in our study, but we focus on the rental aspects of those programs. We also exclude mixed income housing programs. There are a number of these across the country, of course. They've been in existence in New York State and New York City for a long time, but we've considered those outside the scope of our program or outside of our study. There are other programs that may or may not be focused on middle income or workforce housing needs, but don't entail a public subsidy. I'm thinking of programs like inclusionary housing, for example. There's one down in Miami-Dade that is a workforce housing inclusionary zoning ordinance that allows for building at greater densities, but doesn't involve a direct subsidy. And then there are other types of programs, ADU programs, things that private sector actors can kind of initiate. Again, that results in a number of exclusions of these programs. So as a result, we include 11 programs in our survey, but we don't consider this and don't think of this as an exhaustive list, even then, but are more meant to be illustrative and illustrate and exemplify some of the program characteristics. What is our purpose, I guess, identifying these programs? We want to understand them better, for starters, as they become more common across the country. So how many are there, where and when they're created, where do they operate, how are they funded, who do they serve, and what do they do? All questions are asked and answered in this paper, and we'll answer some here today in our presentation. They also relate to for this first research question here that you don't necessarily, I won't read now because that's all, I've already said it more or less. But here's our list of 11 programs. It's sorted right now by the year they were created, and we'll keep that kind of constant throughout as I show this table and how it changes over these different slides. So in our examination of these programs, we also identified a number of general themes that characterize them, right? There's no single archetype for what these middle income housing programs look like, but there are a number of themes that emerged from our analysis of them. And I think it makes sense to start with some very basic ones that are kind of obvious. You get even looking at this list, right? Here are our 11 programs. For starters, they're generally newer, right? Most of them have been created since 2020, since the pandemic. The Michigan program in 2022, for example, used American Rescue Plan Act funds. And I believe other programs in here have done that as well. But it's also important to note that these programs aren't entirely new either, right? So the moderate income housing program down in Kansas has existed since 2012. And the Massachusetts Workforce Housing Initiative has existed since 2016. Another second theme is that these programs exist in every region of the country. And not only that, right, they encompass a range of market conditions, affordability challenges, and political environments. This is suggestive to me, right, that both the recency of these programs and their broad geographic diversity likely reflects the growing affordability challenges of middle income households in much of the country since the start of the pandemic. A fourth theme, right, is that nearly all middle income housing programs use a percent of AMI threshold to determine eligibility. So precise definitions vary, but 9 of the 11 programs we look at use a percent of AMI threshold. rather than something else like employment status, occupation, or what have you. And this largely mirrors program eligibility criteria and characteristics for federally funded mental assistance programs. I'll outline the two exceptions. In Minnesota, there's no eligibility criteria. Minnesota actually funds new market rate construction, but in places that are difficult to develop and have a documented need, a documented employment need based on business attestation. In Breckenridge, there's a number of programs happening in Breckenridge, some based on AMI, but others that are more explicitly about or reserved for seasonal workers or those employed in the county that Breckenridge is located in. So there are some exceptions, but generally these programs use a percent of AMI threshold to determine eligibility. A fourth thing is what activities do these programs fund, and there's a focus particularly on supply and expanding supply, but especially new construction. Some programs also, and I tried to highlight or bold where new construction comes up in the purpose of each of these, right? It's not just new construction in a lot of cases, right? Some programs also fund rehabilitation, some fund adaptive reuse, others fund acquisition and conversion. To give kind of an example, in Colorado, the Middle Income Housing Authority there, that's relatively new, has been charged with the creation of 3,500 affordable units affordable to middle income households by their definition, but 80% of them must be newly built. The sole exception among programs we studied where new construction isn't a component at all really is California, where the CSCDA, the California States Community Development Association, or forget exactly, their workforce housing program funds only the exact acquisition of market rate properties and converts them to rent and income restricted affordable units. But every other program has a new construction component, if not an emphasis. A fifth theme is that these programs directly fund middle-income housing developments through grants and loans. So there are different models for how these get funded, but most are forgivable construction loans to developers, private developers. So this includes programs in Massachusetts, Minnesota, Rhode Island. Others use grants. I mentioned Michigan and its ARP funds, American Rescue Plan Act funds, which are used explicitly to cover the cost of construction and labor costs. That was a particular challenge during the pandemic when ARP was passed. In Georgia, the state would provide a slightly different funding model, but infrastructure funding, both grants and loans to local governments who then would partner with a developer to provide new housing. The exceptions to this are also kind of in Florida, where it's missing middle property tax exemption. Developers with products with projects over, I think it's 70 units, would receive a property tax exemption for keeping units affordable at different, and the amount of the size of the property tax exemption would actually vary with the level of affordability between both lower income and more middle income households. A sixth theme is that a few middle income programs create or enable opportunities for public ownership of housing, while others leverage publicly owned land. So as I mentioned, most programs examined in our study incentivize private sector development and ownership of housing, but there are a few cases where that isn't true. So in California, like I mentioned, where the point is to acquire market rate units and make them affordable to middle income households, those are ultimately owned by the local government. The Middle Income Housing Authority in Colorado also expressly enables the authority to acquire, own, and operate middle income housing. That's in addition to its powers to finance private sector construction. And then in Philadelphia, slightly different. The Workforce Housing Credit Enhancement requires the land for the program to be purchased by one of several city agencies, the Public Housing Authority, the Redevelopment Authority, et cetera. And these homes aren't ultimately publicly owned. The different programs kind of provide different models for public ownership and how to use public assets. The seventh theme, affordability periods for property owners vary, but are generally modest. And by affordability period, I mean the length of time the middle income housing program needs to be kept affordable for middle income households. So in Florida and Kansas, there's compliance periods of about 3 and 5 years. In Michigan, there's a 10-year compliance period. And then on the longer side, you do see in Massachusetts a compliance period of 15 to 40 years. And at least 30 years in Rhode Island. There are other programmatic differences in terms of rent increases, to what extent that's allowed, and other compliance requirements. We detail some of those in the study. The impact of middle income housing programs is still uncertain but evolving. This project was not meant to be our project, our study. It was not meant to be a full evaluation or like a cost benefit analysis of these programs. Many are just too new to even do that effectively, right? But we did try to get a sense of the scale of these programs, where that was possible and what they're trying to do. So just a few examples here, right? The Kansas Middle Income Housing Program awarded $27 million to build about 1,000 units just last year. And Georgia, a similar time frame, $24 million in infrastructure grants and loans to also fund about 1,000 units, but that's for sale and for rent both. And then the Michigan Missing Middle program, I think over 3 different funding rounds, used about $110 million to more directly support 90 different developments. And I don't know exactly how many units are in those developments. Again, that's both for sale and for rent or rental housing. Per unit funding varies, but is generally modest. So it's similarly difficult to compare per unit funding levels, just like it's difficult to compare impact, because they're funding different activities and have such different requirements, different funding mechanisms in the first place. But again, if you look at kind of the maximum provided across 3 of these programs that fund development a little more directly, you see in Massachusetts, loans up to $100,000 per affordable unit. In Michigan, a variation of $70,000 to $80,000 per unit, and that depends on the size of the project. And then in Rhode Island, it varies. The subsidy per unit of $60,000 to $80,000 per unit. That depends on the number of bedrooms actually in the unit. And our last theme, many middle income housing programs focus on production in rural areas or difficult to develop places. And this is where labor challenges make it difficult or harder to build housing. So for example, in Georgia, the Rural Workforce Housing Initiative there funds infrastructure projects to enable middle income housing development in rural counties only. And these programs define rural a little bit differently, and that's an important distinction, but not enough time to get into that today. In Michigan, 30% of funding is set aside for rural counties. And then in Minnesota, funding is only available for projects in small or medium-sized cities or in tribal areas only. So you see these different geographic emphases and requirements. Also, I think it's worth calling out Breckenridge, which I think exemplifies a different kind of geographic trend. So Breckenridge is an affluent ski town with a large tourism industry and seasonal labor force, right? And where middle income housing strategies have become really popular, not just in Breckenridge, but in other communities kind of like it across the country, just as a way of providing affordable housing options to the workforce there. And so you've seen a growing emphasis on the shortage of this kind of housing in communities across the country, and that's been picked up. So Breckenridge kind of exemplifies a certain trend. These are all 10 themes laid out. We're not going to go through them obviously here, but they're there for reference. So take a breath. Now we move from analyzing these middle income housing programs to thinking more about who they intend to serve, right? That's particularly important as these programs become increasingly common. What are the characteristics of these households? what are the extent of their affordability challenges? How do those challenges vary across the country? And then ultimately, we'll consider what it would take to address those challenges and what kinds of trade-offs does that entail. Those are our last three research questions in so many words right there. So again, I won't read those now or read those again, essentially. But an important question is like, how do we answer these questions, right? What we do is use one common definition in the state and local programs we analyzed. In this case, we look at those earning 60 to 120% of area median income and then operationalize that definition in the American Community Survey, which is a very detailed and commonly used survey on housing issues in the country, released every year by the US Census Bureau. To look at kind of narrower geographies, we use NLHC's method, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, their method for identifying area median income. I'm not going to explain that now. Happy to answer questions about it. You can read about it more in the paper. By operationalizing that 60 to 100% of AMI band in the ACS for 2022, you identify about 14.4 million middle income renters in the country. So, right, if housing policies and programs are going to increasingly focus on those 14.4 million renters, it would be good to know more about who these middle income renters are and about the affordability challenges they face. Let's start with those affordability challenges. So as we've seen in prior research in SON, a trend we've talked about for a long time, confirmed and looked at again in this report, middle income renter burdens have indeed risen rapidly in a very short time. So about 1/3 of middle income renters, again, those earning 60 to 100%, 120% of AMI were cost burden. That's up 6.3 percentage points from 2019. By comparison, lower income renters, right, those earning up to 60% of AMI, their cost burden rate increased by 2.5 percentage points from 2019 to 2022. So less than half the rate of the increase among middle income renters. But it's still true that affordability challenges are much more severe for lower income renters. 33%, as I said, 1/3 of middle income renters were cost burdened. Of those 33%, just under 5% had severe burdens. That means they spent more than 50% of their income on housing. By comparison, 80% of lower income renters had cost burdens, and that includes more than half with severe burdens. So 53% of lower income renters had severe burdens, that blue bar on the far left. So in other words, lower income renters had cost burdens at over twice the rate as middle income renters, but they had severe renter burdens at more than 10 times the rate of middle income renters. It's also true that these affordability challenges decline rapidly with income, but within the middle income group, there's still considerable variation. So for renters earning 60 to 80% of AMI, nearly half, right, 47% were cost burdened in 2022. By the time you get to the high end of our middle income distribution, this is true nationally, just 17% of those earning 100 to 120% of AMI had cost burdens. I think it's also important to think about the affordability challenges that these households face by thinking about the residual income. So the residual income is what is left over after these households spend money on housing. So what is left over after you pay your housing per month? So the median residual income for lower income renters was $600. That's among those, I'm sorry, with cost burdens. $600 for low income renters with cost burdens compared to $2,900 for middle income renters. Middle income renter burdens vary considerably across the country. On the top of the scale, not labeled, but is North Dakota, where just 6% of middle income renters were cost burdened. At the bottom of our scale here is Florida, where 55% of middle income renters were cost burdened. And middle income renter burdens, maybe this isn't surprising, market conditions vary, right? The middle income renter burdens actually vary considerably more than lower income renter burdens, right? So lower income households have relatively high cost burdens pretty much everywhere in the country. Middle income renters very much more with market conditions. So cost burdens are generally higher in higher cost places for middle income renters, but for lower income renters, again, their housing affordability challenges are significant regardless of the housing market context they live in. This map kind of gives you a better sense of that, right? And shows you the extent to cost burdens vary by state. Cost burdens exceed 40% in 5 states, right? I already mentioned Florida, where it's about 55%, but besides that, all of these states were in the West. So in Hawaii, Nevada, California, and Arizona. There were also significant affordability challenges for middle income renters in parts of the South and Northeast. In the Midwest, middle income renter burdens were generally lower. So as these programs have become more popular, it's important to consider what kinds of households would be served by these programs. And then you can really consider the trade-offs that might come from this growing emphasis on middle income housing programs. So here I'm showing you renter households with cost burdens specifically broken down by area median income. On the left, you have lower income households, middle income households next to it are on the right. So relative to lower income households, middle income renters overall have fewer vulnerabilities and higher earning potential. By definition, of course, they have higher incomes. So that's not surprising, right? Middle income renters earned about $57,000 annually at the median compared to $20,000 among lower income renters with cost burdens. That's those two up top are medians. The rest are kind of just the share of households in each of those groups. So middle income renters are also less likely to have children than lower income renters. 22% of middle income renters have children compared to 28% of lower income renters. And again, these are renters with cost burdens specifically. So those with the affordability challenges. These households are also less likely to have a disability, so 13% of middle income renters versus 27% of lower income renters. They're also much less likely to have an older adult, or be headed by an older adult. 13% of middle income renters versus 21% of lower income renters. Middle income renters have other economic advantages. More likely to be headed by someone in their more prime age in their prime working age, and more likely to have a bachelor's degree, twice as likely to have a bachelor's degree, right? So middle income renters with cost burdens, 41% of them had a college degree compared to 19% of lower income renters. On the bottom of the slide, middle income renters are also more likely to be non-Hispanic white and less likely to be a person of color. So 51% of middle income renters with burdens were white compared to 43% of lower income renters with cost burdens. 17% of middle income renters were Black compared to 24% of lower income renters. So it's important to think about what funding and prioritizing middle income households and middle income housing programs would mean for who you're funding differentially. So now we're moving on to this idea of the problematic nature of the concept of workforce housing and why it's problematic. Starting with kind of the motivation of these middle income programs. So middle income programs are often motivated by the desire to address the affordability challenges of the workforce. So for example, that Michigan Missing Middle Housing Program in its general kind of motivation seeks to increase the supply of workforce housing to support the growth and economic ability of employees, providing grants funds to developers. At the same time, as we showed previously, most of these programs define eligibility based on some income definition. And that's why is that potentially problematic, right? That's potentially problematic because you're you're missing a large section of the workforce by bypassing lower income renters in a lot of cases, right? So lower income renters in the workforce outnumber middle income renters in the workforce. So among the 21.3 million lower income renters, 15.5 million had someone in the labor force, including about half of those who worked full time. In this case, when I say full time, they worked at least 35 hours per week and 48 weeks in the prior year. That's about 75, 3/4 of lower income households are in the workforce. And the vast majority of those not in the labor force were headed by an older adult or someone with a disability. So that's about 4.7 million of the 5.8 million in that blue bar on the right there. It's also important to note that working even full time does not guarantee affordability. So among renter households who have someone in the household working full time, 79% of lower income renters were still cost burdened, and that's pretty close to the 80% share of all lower income renters. Similarly, 31% of middle income renters who had someone in the household working full time had cost burdens. Again, slightly lower than the 33% share of all cost burden. So affordability challenges aren't alleviated automatically by even having someone working full time in the household. As a result, right, a majority of renters, even in the labor force with cost burdens, someone working full time or part time, are lower income households. So among the 9.8 million renters working full time with cost burdens, 5.8 million were lower income or earning up to 60% of AMI. That surpasses the 3.6 million middle income renters with cost burdens who were in the workforce. So a middle income or workforce housing program that purports to address the affordability challenges of the workforce that excludes the majority of the workforce with housing cost burdens is at best inaccurate, is at best a misnomer, right? Use of the term workforce housing is also a reaction, right, at the same time to stereotypes with classist and racist undertones related to both public assistance generally, but also affordable housing programs specifically. So for all these reasons, we refrain from using the term workforce housing, or recommend against using it generally. And that's particularly how it's operationalized in most of these programs. And we prefer the term that's just more accurate, middle income housing. Lastly, we want to consider, in my final 5 to 10 minutes before we get to Q&A, the potential trade-offs and benefits of middle income housing programs, and consider in particular what it might mean for state and local governments to continue prioritizing middle income affordability challenges. As I mentioned before, there are concerns about what middle income housing programs represent, and very valid concerns, I think, in a lot of ways. So there's a concern that focusing on middle income renters might direct resources away from low income renters, those with the greatest affordability challenges that we've already shown, right? And it's worth saying that the lower income households with burdens are already not getting the funding they need. So 3 in 4 income eligible renters do not receive a housing subsidy that they're eligible for. At the same time, middle income renters have fewer economic vulnerabilities. More people in their prime earning years have higher levels of education, are less likely to have a disability, and less likely to have a child in the home. Middle income renters are also more likely to be non-Hispanic white and less likely to be a person of color. So still, these programs have become more common, have a lot of appeal, a lot of potential benefits, right? And for starters, it's worth thinking about why and what the benefits and how they might be leveraged, right? So for starters, they garner greater attention for housing affordability issues just in general. In a lot of places, it looks like middle income housing programs might be more politically tenable for state and local governments also at the same time. Of course, a potential benefit of them is they address affordability challenges of middle income renters directly, in a way maybe that can help them build longer term savings especially for something like a down payment for retirement or for an emergency. And this is clearly a reaction to the growing affordability challenges that these households face. They incentivize new construction, right? That's especially helpful in places with particularly severe affordability challenges or where the market, can't serve those households. Um, um, these programs, so that new construction, particularly if it's targeted to enable more mixed income communities, right? And that can mean both areas of opportunity. We're building any kind of rental housing with any kind of affordability restriction would be a boon, or in gentrifying areas, so rapidly growing, rapidly developing areas where something other than the highest end development would be helpful for allowing, again, a more mixed income environment or a more mixed income neighborhood. These programs might also help bridge the gap between existing rental assistance programs and the private market. So they just create more options for low-income households who receive rental assistance and then climb up the income scale, rather than allowing those households to go immediately from low-income housing assistance to the private market. There's a potential bridge that gets them there. Also, these programs can be done at a relatively low cost, right? It's a small investment compared to some other potential programs. And to put a finer point on that about cost, right? We consider how much it would take to address the affordability needs of all renter households across the country. And this is very illustrative, kind of back of the envelope, right? But $193 billion were needed in 2022 to close all cost burden gaps for renter households. So how much income would have been needed if you took all cost burden households and made them not cost burden, right? And it's $193 billion annually. Because middle income renters have cost burdens at lower rates, and because their burdens are generally modest, just $31 billion would be needed to make all cost burden middle income renters whole. And that's just 16% of the 193 billion overall. Just a note on policy implications and conclusion. We'll wrap up here. I already mentioned these key takeaways, right? I think it's worth revisiting, at least in brief. So the affordability challenges have grown to record levels across the US for renter households. Renter households, that's especially true for middle income renters, right? These burdens also vary significantly across the country, depending on market conditions, depending on how expensive your housing is. In response, a growing number of state and local governments have created policies and programs to address these challenges. The program characteristics that we look at, of course, vary, but they're generally very geographically diverse. They focus on supply, especially new supply, new construction, and are largely targeted based on area median income. But affordability challenges remain greatest and most pervasive for lower income households. As a result, you need to consider the trade-offs and benefits of this growing emphasis on middle income housing needs. And that's what we attempted to do in this paper, what I attempted to do for you all today. And on the policy implications side, in many cases and in many communities, right, you can enable middle income housing construction at an even more cost-effective way, right? You could liberalize local zoning ordinances and allow construction of a range of housing types. And those kinds of policies might be most effective in a number of communities, right? And some ways you can do that are eliminating or reducing exclusionary single-family zoning, allowing apartments to exist in a number of communities, right? You could allow and encourage ADU development. You can expedite permitting processes, streamline different kinds of environmental review, right? But maybe there are places where middle income housing policies and programs are still worthwhile or still going to be pursued, maybe even no matter what, right? It's worth thinking about in what context and what circumstances those programs would be necessary then, so or more viable or desirable then. So middle income housing programs might work in places where middle income renters are not being appropriately served, right? Places where middle income affordability challenges are greatest or in difficult to build environments. In many programs that we looked at, for example, you see a particular focus on rural areas or in places where housing development is generally harder, but there's still a need. Um, um, but a couple of caveats, and I think a couple of important things to really emphasize. Middle income housing policy should never come at the expense of lower income housing programs where the need is greatest, right? So these programs should be designed in a way that complements these programs or supplements them. So for example, focus on the low end of the middle income distribution, right? That 80 to 100% of AMI band, where nearly half of renters were still cost burdened nationally. Um, and you must have sufficiently long affordability requirements to make any investment worthwhile. And again, these programs have a number of other potential benefits we've already kind of discussed. And I'll end by just saying more research and evaluation is needed. I think as these programs become more common, it's important to look at and think about what they're doing and why. This is a start, I hope, but I hope folks will continue to look at them more and think about how they complement each other and evaluate them. So that's it for me. David, I think you're going to come back on and hopefully, I guess we got 15 minutes for questions or so.
Thank you. Really rich, as always. Set of findings, I think some provocative questions. We've got a bunch of really interesting questions in the Q&A. I encourage folks to put others in. Let me just start there. There are a couple of kind of clarifying questions, and you might have covered this. A couple of people asked about affordability restrictions. So, what was the range of how long are these units required to be affordable for middle income households?
Yeah, so they varied, right? And we had a table in the paper that's worth looking at. So on the low end, you had some affordability requirements for about 3 to 5 years, I believe in Florida and Kansas where that was true. On the high end, so in Michigan, kind of in the middle, there was a 10-year affordability requirement for rental housing projects. Massachusetts, I think, had a variation of 15 to 40 years. And then Rhode Island, I believe, there were affordability requirements of at least 30 years. And then there are programs that allowed and enabled more permanent affordability. That California program that acquired market rate housing and converted it. So as long as that housing, I imagine, was owned by the local government agency that engaged in the program, it would remain permanently affordable. Similarly, the Colorado Middle Income Housing Authority does allow for, we're not sure to what extent it's been used. It's a very new program. More permanent affordability, actual direct ownership by the Middle Income Housing Authority. Those kinds of programs that actually enable more permanent situations and affordability.
I guess related to that is the extent to which the money is going to private, like to what share of the programs or what share of the money, as best you can figure, is going to private developers, nonprofit entities, and then purely public entities.
Yeah, most of them do fund private construction of housing, right? Or non. I don't know. I'm trying to think if any of them privilege nonprofit developers specifically. I don't know that off the top of my head. Is not something I noted in particular. Looking at these programs, definitely not one of the themes we tease out. But the emphasis is on new supply and incentivizing new housing construction. Most of that is being done by developers who are, of course, not the state and local government agencies.
A question that I was really struck by your focus on both the distribution of where cost burden middle income renters lived, at least by state, and also their differences, the differences between cost burden middle income renters and lower income renters. I was curious, given several of the programs you highlighted focused on rural, and I don't know if you in your analysis looked at cost burdens by whether folks were in urban, suburban, or rural locations.
We did. No, so for this project, we did not. But we have looked at this in other contexts and other circumstances, right? In general, households who live in rural areas have lower cost burdens than they do in metro areas, and particularly in larger markets, right? And obviously that's more true in some cases in higher cost places, though not always. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there are rural areas who don't have particular housing challenges. I'd say kind of two things. One, um, demand in those areas can still be relatively high and construction can still be needed. But rural areas tend to be more difficult places to build. There might not be as many private sector development firms, home builders operating in those areas. So capacity constraints exist in rural areas in a way they don't exist in a lot of large markets. There might be other challenges in large markets, but we'll think about that. Um, um, I had a second thought, but and if it comes back to me, we'll
That
get.
that that, that's fine. I was struck, and there was some commentary again on this in the Q&A, that the per unit MAC is well below the cost of producing those units. I would assume. I don't think anybody's producing units at 60 or 70 or 80,000. And some of this
Yeah.
is coming from the income you can generate. Some of this may be coming from other programs. But it made me wonder, is that a significantly lower number than for programs that are subsidizing housing for low income households, or what do you make of that limit? And at least one person said, do we know if they're actually loaning up to that limit, or if the actual loans are much smaller?
That's a great question, right? And it's something that we don't know. I think when we talk about the need to evaluate these programs, both what the actual expenditures are, and we have some sense of that, but more so what gets delivered and whether, right, the requirements set out are actually followed for the period of time they're supposed to be followed. So hopefully someone does that work. If it's not us, hopefully someone else does that, right? I think the question absolutely speaks to one of the benefits of these kinds of the potential benefits, right? These production subsidies are relatively low. And what I showed you in the case of Massachusetts and in Michigan, and I forget, and I think Rhode Island, right? That 60 to 80 to $100,000 per unit subsidy. Those are higher. They're not the same kinds of programs, but if you look at like Kansas and Georgia, that might fund infrastructure development, right? And require with that the local government to partner with a local developer to build the units. You have per unit subsidies that are closer to $20,000, $30,000, right? And we couldn't do this. Is something we looked at, was like a direct comparison with a program like LIHTC, right? The low income housing tax credit that fund the primary funder of new housing construction for low income households across the country. It's not a one-to-one. There's no direct comparison, so we didn't want to put it in. But if you looked at the expenditures per unit that come with LIHTC development, they're much higher than even the highest program. So it speaks to part of the appeal, right? If you can expand supply, especially in difficult to develop areas, especially in places with great need at a relatively low cost, it makes sense on some level why, right, these programs have become more popular, and some would say needed, right?
I was really struck, and I think this is a theme that goes through a bunch of the questions we've got, around your point of well, why would you do these given the low income, the needs of low income households? Um, and at least part of the answer, I think you're hinting at, is it may change the politics. And it made me wonder. So I was trying to think about how would we think about that? And it made me wonder if you have any sense, and this would, I assume, be anecdotal, although it may have been more rigorous research than I'm giving you credit for, of to what extent were these middle income programs part of a larger package that also included a robust program to help low income renters? And to what extent were these really standalones, that in places that said we're just going to do middle income?
I think there's some of both in there. I right, like I'm trying to, so in the Florida case, right, that missing middle property tax exemption that Florida used, it's part of a broader initiative to exempt property taxes for both for low income and middle income housing construction. Um, um, what Michigan, for example, did as part of its ARP funding. I don't know if there was a broader strategy. I forget off the top of my head to fund other kinds of housing initiatives. I think in some cases that was certainly true. Um, I think, part of what's unique about this is the range of places you're seeing with, right? Like, and you could present the states without, well, I just said Florida and Michigan, but also Colorado and California and Massachusetts and Kansas, right? Like those are very different kinds of places, very different political environments, very different market contexts, where these kinds of programs in most cases are new or relatively new. And I'm not sure they would have existed 15 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly. And it speaks to, in my mind, the affordability challenges across the country. They've just become more pervasive, right? Maybe folks in a lot of those states wouldn't have seen the need to address housing in that way, but housing has become an issue du jour, right? I forget, someone tweeted out of this, right? Kamala Harris in her opening statements in the debate brought up housing within her first couple of sentences, right? And it's just not, yeah, that the environment has shifted, the need have shifted, the problems have changed. And you're seeing this different response now at the state and local level.
Yes. No, I think that's this is a place where I think the quantitative research that you've done, it'd be really kind of interesting to have somebody match that with some qualitative research where you really sort of understand um, the conditions under which programs came out.
Absolutely.
Really, I think wonderful question here. And actually, let me go back to it. I'm going to read it directly. Do you have a recommended set of market conditions to look for to decide if investment in middle-income households are warranted? Or alternative, what indicators at a local level would you look for to know if or where middle-income renters aren't being appropriately served? So
Yeah,
again,
great
people
questions.
like you are always getting calls up from journalists, from
Sure.
legislators or their staff. What would you kind of look for to say, yeah, I think this is really needed?
Yeah, I think, and I wouldn't say really needed in any, right? Like, hard to make hard and fast recommendations,
Yeah.
but there are some things I would look at when I think about the suitability of these kinds of programs. And the first thing is how I started the policy recommendations, right? Is can you get the outcome you're looking for on the new supply end just by enabling builders to build what they're going to build, right? Like that was, you know, a little mealy mouth, but right. Could you liberalize zoning laws? Could you improve your permitting processes? Or can you, right, like reduce parking requirements? The suite of things that are basically costless, and I think are going to be appropriate in most markets. That's where communities should look to first. But I think there are communities where you can say maybe there is a need, both, and that need looks like two things, right? The need is related to how deep are their affordability challenges for middle income renters? Are they especially severe in that market? Um, and then the other thing, or the other kind of context, um, um, is can you build the housing sufficient, right? Like I guess that goes back kind of to the first point around enabling, but there are places, right? We talked about difficult developed areas, right? Where building is just difficult. Housing development is just difficult, or more difficult, more of a challenge. And maybe some subsidy, especially a shallower subsidy, like these are often, right, might be helpful to kind of spur development and address a very real challenge, a very real affordability issue. And then I guess the third thing is ensuring that those resources wouldn't be better served going towards lower income households, right? Are you doing enough for lower income households in any market context who are bearing the brunt of the affordability issues, right? But maybe if you put some of that money into middle income housing challenge, you could benefit lower income households, freeing up portions of the stock in a shower subsidy, bringing in a different kind of developer, et cetera. So I guess that was three things that I would think about.
Um, Very helpful and a terrific place to end. Again, apologies. There's a really rich set of questions. We will share those with you, and you may want to follow up or not, as the case may be. I just want to a couple things that just really struck me. I mean, one is I think it's a wonderful example of where it's really important to look at the data around things that have a certain, have a certain appeal, are important, have an important rationale. But I think, the way you structured this is saying, look, there's all this stuff going on, and now let's just sort of step back and think about who's being helped, who might not be being helped. I just, we sometimes wonder about the importance, and to me, it was just a great example of using the data to understand the magnitude of problems and the impacts of potential solutions. And I think two things that I just want to underscore that really jump out from your presentation, both of which you said. I mean, one is, yes, there are a lot of cost burdened middle income renters, but there are a heck of a lot more cost burdened low income renters, and what was it, 10 times as many severely cost burdened low income renters. And so making sure we don't, in the swirl of things, forget about folks. And then the other, and this really comes through in the paper, even I think even more strongly, and I really encourage folks to read the paper, is what a misnomer the word workforce housing is. I think just a wonderful and important plea to say, this is really kind of language that sounds lovely, and has a kind of hidden and poor message. So I guess I want to thank you for a great piece of work that I think helps us think better about important problems and points us in important policy directions, which is often the goal of what we try and do. And I think this is just a wonderful example of it. So I hope those of you who are online will join me in thanking Alex for a terrific presentation. And have a great day, everybody. We'll see you online and in person at our upcoming events. Thanks a lot.